we're in a profession where vulnerability is considered a terrible thing. You certainly never want to be vulnerable in a business position or in a negotiation, but it's actually your superpower when you're creating a relationship with another human being. AI will never be able to instill trust like two human beings can with one another. AI will not be able to manage or motivate a group of employees like a good leader can. Well, cross-selling is something that inherently, I think, in our industry has a dissonance that most people don't point to. And the dissonance is this, the individual lawyer is rarely motivated to cross-sell.
David, thank you very much for joining me this morning. I've been looking forward to having you on the show, and I'm glad we managed it.
Gary, it's always great to reconnect with you. Thanks for having me.
Well, I look forward to today's episode. And David, I want to start with some of the basics, just telling a little bit the audience about who David is. And I certainly know a bit about your background growing up, et cetera, but let's start at the basics. Who's David?
Sure.
And how your upbringing and how David ended up being the person that is here today?
Sure. Well, it was a windy road for sure. I grew up on the East Coast in the Washington, D.C. area. And for about as long as I can remember, I wanted to be an actor. I would watch television shows and I would say, oh, that's so cool what they're doing. They're pretending to have this life that's completely different from their own. That's what I want to do. And so I pursued an acting career for many years. I got my bachelor's in acting. I came out to Los Angeles. I was in a bunch of TV shows. I did a lot of theater and had a pretty good run of it. But, as anyone who has ever tried a career in the arts will tell you, it's very much a feast or famine lifestyle. So when I was on a TV show, I'd be making good money, but then the TV show would get canceled or my role would, conclude, and then I'd spend many months completely unemployed. So it wasn't really a sustainable lifestyle, especially once I got married. I happened to get married to a lawyer, and she pointed out that a lot of the skills that I had developed either through acting or through the various other jobs I had had while I was sustaining myself as an actor could all be used to help lawyers. And so she said, specifically communication skills, presentation skills. You've learned a lot about how to manage rejection and how to pitch yourself and audition for roles. And, all of these soft skills are ultimately things that lawyers don't learn in law school. But in order for them to thrive as leaders and rainmakers, they need to develop. Why don't we put together a company that brings some of those skills to the legal industry? So, of course, I did the right thing, which was I said, "You're right, dear. Let's just do that." And her ideation very much shaped the phase of my career that transitioned out of acting and into what I've been doing for the last 20 plus years.
And David, that's always the right answer. Yes, dear. But, who would have thought that you'd end up from being an actor to working with lawyers? Like, it's not certainly the path that you imagined as a kid, but that's life. And to your point, it's windy. And I bet you as a skill set, it's far more needed for lawyers than the typical sort of consulting they'll get from peers of their traditional peers. That is more the like versus your unique approach.
Well, I think, there are a lot of people out there who are very competent when it comes to helping lawyers with some of these soft skills, especially in the arena of business development, which is, where we focus. But it is unique to have a rich background in the arts and a master's in psychology, which I ended up getting as part of this transition. And then, of course, Rebecca, my wife, is still very much a part of the company. So she brings that legal acumen to the table. So I like to think of it as a balanced approach and certainly one that has given me the opportunity to repurpose a lot of those skills in a more stable way.
And David, I'm going to go back one more time to sort of your upbringing, et cetera. Who had the biggest influence on you sort of growing up or even throughout the career? And typically I ask for one person, but if you needed more than one, that's fine too.
Well, I've been blessed, Gary, to have many mentors in my life, and I have always sought out mentors. I've found this whole notion of mentorship to be very much a resonant one for me. I mentor many people today. I've had many mentors growing up. There were several in particular as I was first coming out to Los Angeles, where I knew no one. Literally, I had no contacts out here. And I reached out to people who I knew through my alumni network. And many of them sort of took me under their wing and taught me the legal industry or taught me the business world, taught me distinctions that I use to this day. So I would say that, it'd be hard to name just one, but there are at least three people who I was working for and took a special interest in making sure that I was mentored, and we're still friends to this day.
And that makes a huge difference, David. And I think mentorship in general, we've heard time after time on this show that it can be such an amplifier and can really help short circuit learnings and sometimes even access with the right people.
That's absolutely right.
So, David, you obviously identified a need in the market, and to your point, while there were others that were doing it, you had a unique touch to it. And obviously, your wife had a sort of a big influence in saying, "Here's what it is, and here's how you'd approach it." But as any entrepreneur that has been through their cycles of growing a business, what were some of the initial challenges and some of the while you identify the opportunity, I'm sure it didn't become an overnight success right away. It obviously took some hard work, and I've certainly seen you over the years and that evolution. But take us through a little bit about what that journey looked like and any of the learnings along the way to share with fellow entrepreneurs.
Sure. Well, yeah, I mean, the first several years were very difficult. We are a bootstrap company, so it's not like we had investors that were backing us, right? So I went from being an actor with an unpredictable income to suddenly being newly married and to suddenly, starting a business with my wife. So there were several challenges. I mean, the least of which were financial in the first several years. It was very difficult to get the business off the ground. We were an unknown at the time commodity, and we didn't have the network of law firms that we've certainly built today. The other challenge was starting a business with your life partner. So, Rebecca and I thought rather naively that we could run the business as business partners in the same way that we were managing our relationship. As husband and wife, we make decisions together. We have sort of equal authority in that process. But in the business, we found that there was no tiebreaker. So if we disagreed on something as business partners, then things would just get stuck and bottlenecked. So it took us a few years to realize that we needed delegation, where there are certain things in the business that she's responsible for, and she is the ultimate decision maker. And whether I agree or disagree, she gets to make the call. And then there are a lot of things in the business where that's my role. And while I will often come to her and get her perspective, at the end of the day, it's my decision. So that was a lesson that we had to learn.
And I can appreciate that, David. And it's a good tip to also give to sort of other entrepreneurs that work with family that while sometimes that can be easy and intuitive to work with family team members, to contemplate these dynamics in advance and try to have a bit of that separation of church and state, so to speak, and say, here's how we're going to manage this, and here's how it's going to be different than the family relationship.
Yeah, that's right. I think the other lesson that I would share is one that I'm learning more recently, which is that you really want to be thinking 5 to 10 years out. And I think especially those of us in professional services where it's very much about billing time and about, let's just have a good year, right? Or even a good month. We tend not to look more strategically at where we're headed in the next 3, 5, 10 years. And we've started doing that a lot more in the business in terms of really grooming that next generation of talent and looking at how things are evolving very quickly with the emergence of AI and what impact that will have in our business, and making sure that we are in front of that problem and not ultimately trying to play catch up with it.
Most definitely. And David, now I'll pivot a little bit to sort of your business more in the current state. Now I want to talk a bit about your offering and what it looks like right now, and I'll ask you a little bit about PipelinePlus, the software. just help our listeners understand a little bit about what that looks like right now.
Sure. Well, so in the beginning, we were working with law firms and other professional services firms in the context of business development coaching and training and helping them with those skills that would be helpful to their growth, but they didn't necessarily get in law school. And about 10 years into the company, we discovered that most firms were really struggling when it came to using technology to manage their business development efforts. In other words, firms had no tracking of business development activity really. And even if they had a CRM or something like that in place, the lawyers weren't using it. Lawyers would say, well, I get a lot of my business from referral sources, but there was no inventory of those referral sources. Like, who are your top referral sources? When was the last time you got a referral from them? When was the last time you gave something to that person? And whether you're talking about a large firm where the referral sources are internal partners with whom you're cross-selling, or a smaller firm where a lot of your referrals are coming from external sources, it was just kind of the Wild West. And it struck me as odd that an institution that would take the billable hour so seriously and track in 6-minute increments is so sloppy when it comes to tracking the thing that's feeding the business, which is these incoming referrals or prospective client relationships and so on. So we decided we would build some software to address that. We built so PipelinePlus is the name of the company. We built something called Tracker, PipelinePlus Tracker, which is a tool that firms use mostly in the context of the coaching engagements that they have with us, but many firms use it independently. And it's basically just a place where they can track their shortlist. Out of all of the relationships you have, who are your most important clients, your most important prospects, and your most important referral sources, let's put those into the app. It's a very simple app. It's very easy to get in and out of. And then it will send you reminders and suggestions on what to do with those people based on how long it's been since you've spoken to them. Or in some cases, you just get stuck. You say, oh, I've known Gary for years, but I'm not really sure what to say to him. We don't have a good excuse to connect. And so the app will give recommendations on that. Very simple idea, but a fundamental function, especially in professional services where we get so busy and so kind of myopically focused on the project on our desk that we forget about filling that pipeline with the work that needs to be invested in for the future.
And David, we know that there's many areas that when it comes to business development, lawyers will need development on. But if you were to say, we'll have a lot of lawyers that will be listeners here, how would you triage it? If some of them are embarking upon training or sort of getting a level of personal development on this side, other than saying, call David, which is always the simplest answer, what tips would you have for them in terms of how the initial triage and what are the areas they should address first, just considering your experience over the years?
Yeah, I would say that it's very important to carve out some time to think about business development strategically. And I know that's a big ask for a timekeeper, right? For someone who is making their money based on billing those hours. You don't want to invest a lot of non-billable time into much of anything. But consider that, even taking 30 minutes, an hour, something like that, to just stop the clock and think about, okay, who is on my short list? Who are my most important relationships? Pick somewhere between 9 and 35 people who are your key clients, referral sources, your prospects. Document them in something. It can be a piece of software. I would recommend a software over a paper list because you can lose that or, it becomes outdated quickly. But put it into a piece of software, preferably something that's going to remind you to reach out to these people. And then make sure that you have some sort of regular accountability structure that brings you back to that list. Because I can't tell you the number of lawyers I've spoken to who've said, oh yeah, I went through that exercise once and I put together a spreadsheet, but I haven't looked at it in months. So it's not really doing you any good because it's not reminding you that it exists. You have to remember to go to it. It's a static document. Right. So, those are some of the initial things I would say, right? It's just based on where you want to take your practice, there is a short list of people who will help you get there. But if you haven't determined who they are and you haven't put certain disciplines around making sure that you are staying connected to them and adding value to them and building momentum in those relationships, then you really just have a wish list and Absolutely. You're not being as proactive or responsible for the future that you want to create.
And David, that's certainly a great place to start. And I think it's, while it may not be as intuitive to everybody, it's a great piece of advice. Now, you've been at working on business development and making sort of relationship development for many, many years. I know you're great at developing that yourself, not just advising people with it. But what did you think is the most valuable lesson you've learned about developing lasting business relationships?
I would say that what we often fall into is a pattern where we create relationships with people. We, earn their trust. They earn ours. It's a good dynamic. But then we take those relationships for granted. And we just assume in the back of our minds, well, of course, we're going to get the call if they ever have a need for our services. And I think time invariably corrects that assumption when we realize, wait a minute, they're working with this other firm. I thought I was their person, right? Or, why is it that I haven't heard from them in so long? And then we console ourselves with this rather silly notion of, well, they just simply don't have any legal work for me right now. Well, if they're running a business, they have legal work all the time. Those two things go hand in hand. So if you haven't heard from someone in 3 months, I'd say you are way overdue for some sort of outreach, and start to give yourself the benefit of some kind of repository of outreach mechanism. So it might be content that you can share with them. It might be some sort of list of uh, outreach ideas, but something that where it's going to make it easier for you to say, oh, I haven't spoken to Gary in 3 months. Gary is a regular referral source, or at least he was. Things have kind of quieted down, or Gary was a client, but he hasn't engaged me for a little while. So where can I go to make this easy for myself rather than sit down, rack my brain and say, gosh, I got to think of something or some excuse to reach out to Gary with. And many times lawyers in particular will hesitate on that because they always want their outreach to be substantive and meaningful. And they don't want to just say, Gary, it's been a while, what's up?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, David, I will take the same notion and apply it to something else that also doesn't come up very intuitively to a lot of lawyers, and that's cross-selling. I think, there are many firms where with a variety of areas of expertise, but because most lawyers are really trained to talk to the clients about their context, they often forget that they can provide a broader spectrum, like a more complete solution, which likely is also more sticky as well with a client because you're helping them in many ways and you become more entrenched. What is your advice for sort of lawyers, individual lawyers, and firms in terms of how to optimize this?
Well, cross-selling is something that inherently, I think, in our industry has a dissonance that most people don't point to. And the dissonance is this, the individual lawyer is rarely motivated to cross-sell. The firm will have all the right messaging. Oh, these clients, as you say, will be more sticky and they'll stay with us longer. And, we'll even compensate you in some way for cross-selling. But at the end of the day, what the individual lawyer is thinking is, well, if I institutionalize my book of business, I can't take it with me if I should want to make a change in the future. So there's this inherent disingenuousness to both the message that's coming from the firm, which never acknowledges the fact that it's not really in your self-interest to cross-sell, and in the lawyer at the firm where, they want to be protective of this asset that they've built over the years. The other disingenuousness that's kind of a part of this is that the clients ultimately would love it if a lawyer came to them and said, hey, I'm going to work out some sort of arrangement where all of your needs are met. It's a one-stop shop. We're going to create this so that it is financially, beneficial for you. And, that way you have lots of options. But again, lawyers are not really motivated to do that. And they have this internal conflict of, I want to make sure that I'm looking out for my clients, but not to the detriment of my own self-interest, right? So this is a very complicated topic ultimately. And people don't talk about the subtext. They just kind of talk about it at a very high level. Here's when we're working with firms, what we advise. We say, look, the fact of the matter is within the firm, you have a short list of lawyers who you trust enough to cross-sell with, and it's probably just 3 or 4 if you're lucky. And you have a short list of clients that you would be willing to introduce to those 3 or 4 lawyers. So just start there. Find that Venn diagram of the few clients that you're willing to cross-sell where you don't feel that that would threaten this asset that you've built professionally, and the few partners who you would trust enough not to mess that relationship up or to try to poach the client or, all the other things that lawyers worry about. And if we just start there, then we have as close to a win-win as I think is likely in a situation that is inherently so paradoxical.
And I think that's a great piece of advice, David, is to start with, less than a handful of both, because that way it's not insurmountable, but it's also a really great way to prove this model and really show they can work.
Ultimately, there is, assuming that the firm has set up a comp structure that rewards cross-selling adequately, there
Absolutely.
is a world in which you can have a win-win here, where you haven't completely institutionalized your client base, but you have optimized the arrangement that the firm really presents as an institution, as a multi-service institution, so that both the clients win, you're able to further monetize and leverage your effort, and ultimately you still have some sort of balance so that if you do feel like you need something portable, you haven't completely compromised that.
And David, great piece of advice. I will shift to something slightly different. So we've seen the industry evolve a fair bit. Technology has become a massive accelerator. What do you think from the various changes we've seen and the evolution in this industry recently, what do you think has impacted business development the most?
Well, I don't think business development has really been impacted by technology that much at all, at least not yet in our industry. Certainly, there are many technologies emerging that are making business development more scalable, more efficient, particularly if you look at the top of the sales funnel. So for those who are unfamiliar with this idea, at the top of the funnel, you have relationships that are perhaps colder. These are potential relationships, potential opportunities that you haven't really nurtured. At the bottom of the funnel, where it's a much kind of tighter group of people, are the people who are your clients or your proven referral sources and the people who are actually generating that business. And there's this exercise of, if you just stay limited to the bottom of the funnel, your practice won't grow, but you want to kind of bring opportunities down through the funnel so that it's an ever expanding endeavor. And at the top of the funnel, AI is doing all kinds of things in terms of, helping us identify who our strongest relationships are, or how to create outreach communications at scale that enable us to warm up more of those relationships quickly. But in the legal profession, there's a lot of reticence around, well, I don't want some bot spamming my contacts. There are all kinds of regulatory concerns around that. And ultimately, we're still thinking about this very much as a relationship business. So if I don't have a relationship with this person, I'm certainly not going to delegate the forming of that to a robot. So I think that, and again, there's a lot to be said for that line of thinking.
Absolutely.
But I think ultimately what we have to acknowledge is that the real threat in our industry when it comes to AI is not so much to the soft skills, because that's the stuff that AI can't do particularly well. AI will never, at least not in the foreseeable future, be able to instill trust like two human beings can with one another. AI will not be able to manage or motivate a group of employees like a good leader can. There's that certain creativity that is ultimately missing in AI. But it can do a lot of the work, especially some of the lower level work that the clients expect to be produced by the law firms in a legal context. And so what AI will ultimately do, and we're already starting to see firms either diminish their associate class, or we just talked to a firm a few weeks ago that had eliminated it altogether. It's just partners in AI, and they're incredibly profitable because they don't have the overhead of, an associate class. And so that's where I think we're headed, is that the work itself, the deliverables, will be assisted through artificial intelligence. But the acquisition of those clients and the process of influencing and ultimately convincing someone to engage your firm will still be on the shoulders of competent rainmakers.
I think that makes a lot of sense, David. Something a bit more to follow this, but also a bit more open-ended. What's one question no one is asking about business development?
I saw you sent some notes ahead, and I saw that one, and I was just like, boy, that one's tough, right? I mean, if I asked you, Gary, what's a question that no one's ever asked you about translations, you might, it might take you a minute to answer that one, because
100%.
we've been talking about this stuff for a long time and thinking about it. And as entrepreneurs, we obsess over what we do for a living, because it's so important to us to do an excellent job of it. And we are in a profession that demands excellence, right? So I'm not sure that there's a question that no one has ever asked. I will say that there's a question that doesn't get explored as much as I wish it would.
That's
And
great as
part
well.
of this is because of the industry that we're in, which is that there is for many, there is a reticence around being vulnerable when it comes to forming relationships in a business development context. And we're in a profession where vulnerability is considered a terrible thing, right? You certainly never want to be vulnerable in a business position or in a negotiation, but it's actually your superpower when you're creating a relationship with another human being. And you would want that relationship to evolve ultimately in a client relationship, but then that's a little tricky too, because we don't want to seem vulnerable to our clients, or perhaps the clients will question whether or not they should use us as a firm. So this is that very nuanced ability that the best rainmakers develop, where they know when to show just enough vulnerability to enable trust, to sort of signal that, hey, it's okay for us to let our guards down in the appropriate context and really be human beings with one another. Whereas there are others who always have their guard up and always have that very professional demeanor going. And it gets very difficult to penetrate that and create a genuine human connection with another person. And so, the question, to go back to your earlier comment, the question that I don't get very often is, how does one start to practice appropriate vulnerability in the context of relationship building? And I think that ultimately the answer to that is, it starts with a willingness to do so. And that takes a lot of courage. It also requires the willingness to maybe get it wrong once or twice, which requires even more courage. But ultimately, the recognition that sharing imperfections about oneself, and again, we want to be appropriate about this, you want to be careful and considered about this, thoughtful about this, but sharing those imperfections from time to time is actually a way to improve your position with another human being, especially when you're in that relationship building context, whether it has to do with business development or the human side of client service, right? Where you are connecting to a client in a way that has the client feel like, wow, this human being and I can really relate to one another. Now let's switch gears and handle something that's on the professional side.
100%. Now, David, on that note, one last question. So when you train lawyers in business development, et cetera, some are really, it comes to them very organically to be very genuine and really connect well with people. But whereas some may be a bit more mechanical. So as you give them some advice, they'll follow a sort of checklist. What are things, obviously being vulnerable is, or showing those vulnerabilities can help sort of bridge the level of human emotion. But what are some other tips you have for lawyers to say, hey, here's how you can come across more genuine and not sort of just scripted and everything, like someone just put a checklist for you?
Again, I think it comes down to uh, a willingness to be authentic.
Authenticity.
There's nothing wrong with saying to someone, hey, I am really working on my ability to be more, a better communicator. And so, I'm trying this new technique, and I may get it wrong. So, just give me a little feedback on this, right?
Yeah.
And again, you want to do that in an environment where it's low stakes and you feel safe. That would be a good conversation to have with a friend at the firm, or that would be a good conversation to have with a coach or someone who is really, rooting for you and looking out for you and not likely to judge you or criticize you. But if you don't give yourself those training grounds, if you just expect to get the instruction manual and then perform perfectly, then you aren't paying attention to the way that top performers actually get there. Right? If you look at, any sort of sport, right, there's a lot of practice sessions before the game. If you look at anyone who has become truly excellent at something, there was a lot of trial by error before they got there. So you have to give yourself a little bit of space and the right forum for your own journey on your way to that destination. And I think that, that's an important kind of resource for someone to set up for themselves.
Those are excellent suggestions, David. One thing I've also recommended, and you can validate it for me, just considering your vast experience, is I always will tell lawyers that, look, taking people for lunch once in a while is fine, but if you show value, if you're proactive and show people you're thinking about them and adding value without necessarily waiting for them to reach out to you for a piece of advice, can always be very helpful. That, hey, I saw this thing, I thought it may be helpful in your context. this new case law or new piece of sort of regulation that may have some impact. Here's some tips I have that may be helpful in case proactively do a little bit of uh, putting that client hat on and really showing them, hey, I do care, even though I may not always be the best at showing it.
Yeah, I think you make a great point. We alluded to this earlier when we talked about having taking aside an hour or so to put those resources kind of on the back burner so that you can quickly have access to them in your proactive outreach with the people on your short list. But you point to something else that's really worth underscoring, which is that we do care about our clients. We certainly don't want our clients to go away. We don't want to make them angry, anything like that. But we don't do a great job of showing that our relationship is anything more than transactional. When we wait for them to call us so that we can bill them for help that they need in this moment, that's not really a caring dynamic, right? That's strictly a business relationship. But when we proactively say, hey, listen, I'm not billing you for this, but I just thought I'd spend 5 minutes finding this thing and crafting this email and sending it to you. Maybe it's helpful, maybe it's not, but just know that I'm thinking about you. That sounds and feels a little bit more like how friends are with each other.
Exactly. David, I'll pivot to a part of our podcast that we'll call the rapid fire questions, or just first word that comes to mind rather quick. And then as we wrap that portion up, I'll come back to you and say, David, if there was one question I should have asked you today, I didn't get a chance to ask, and you're like, I wish Gary would have asked me about this. That way, I give you sort of an open-ended opportunity to address our audience. But before that, we'll go to the rapid fire questions. The first one is, how many languages do you speak?
I speak, I would say, 1.5 languages. So I'm half Persian, so I speak Farsi passably, but English is definitely my first language.
And as the audience can imagine, I've certainly asked David this early on because just naturally I'm always inclined to learn what languages people speak.
Yeah.
David, what's one word that you hate, if any?
I can't think of a word well, I guess there's one word. A word that definitely gives me trouble is the word whatever, because I think a lot of people throw that word out when they're exasperated and when they don't want to communicate anymore. And that's when you've really gotten stuck, right? So if the answer to anything is whatever, then I think it begs maybe some follow-up and perhaps maybe even checking what you've done to get the person to that state.
It's an excellent point. What word do you have a hard time pronouncing, if any?
It isn't pronunciation that I struggle with. It's spelling. So do you know the rule I before E except after C?
Yes.
I mess that up every single time. And I don't understand why we have to flip it just because there was a C. It makes no sense to me whatsoever. So thank God for spell check.
What is your favorite word in any language? So it could be in English, in Farsi, or any other language for that matter.
Gosh, a favorite word. I know I've been using the shortlist a lot because of the book that I recently wrote. So I'll say that whenever I see someone else integrating that into the way that they're describing their focus on business development, then it always gives me a little bit of joy.
And by the way, David, it's on my short list to read the short list.
Oh, great.
I do need to get to it. And what's one word to describe yourself by?
This was a great question when you sent this ahead. Thank you. I did reflect on this. The word I would use is dedicated. So I'm very dedicated to the business. I'm very dedicated to my marriage. I'm very dedicated to my friends. When I sort of step back and look at, where is this kind of consistent theme emerging, I would say that ultimately I either take something on fully and dedicate myself to it, or I don't take it on.
David, I can definitely attest to that. And I've seen that. I've even seen your dedication on your karaoke skills, and it's fascinating.
That's right. Well, I love singing, so why not try to get better at it?
And David, I promised I'd come back to you with sort of open-ended questions like, well, I wish Gary had asked me about this. And certainly, I certainly wanted you to touch on the book as well. But anything else that I may have missed that you're like, I would have liked to speak to this?
Well, I since you mentioned the book, I will share a few takeaways from the book that might be helpful to your listeners. The idea behind the short list, Gary, you and I talked about PipelinePlus tracker. And that piece of software has been in the marketplace for about 12, 13 years now. So we've had thousands of users, in and out of this software, which has given us millions of data points to look at how successful rainmakers build their books of business. And when we look at the subset of users who are most successful, what we find is that on their short list, they have between 9 and 35. I mentioned those numbers earlier. 9 and 35 people. Those who have fewer than 9 tend to have too few at-bats, too few opportunities. And more than 35, there simply isn't enough time in the day to nurture that many relationships in a meaningful way. So that's the one thing we see, is that a short list consists of between 9 and 35 people. We also see that their short lists are diversified. So they have all three categories of client, prospect, and referral source. Sometimes rainmakers will say, well, just focus on your clients. But in fact, that tends to be a short-term strategy, because there are prospective clients that you want to bring into your practice, and you have to also make sure that you're focused on them. And there are referral sources who you don't want to neglect either. So all three of those. And then one of the most interesting insights that we gained from analyzing this subset of users who are growing their books of business while they're using the PipelinePlus Tracker app is that they, on average, have 14 interactions between first contact and first contract. So when you first meet a prospective client, you need to have 14 interactions on average before you get your first piece of work from that person. But ironically, the users who are not as successful would only follow up about once or twice. So they would just give up too quickly. And this gave us this tremendous insight about where business development fails for many people, is that, we're constantly meeting people, and we have 500 plus LinkedIn connections. My goodness, look at all of those opportunities. But we simply fail to stay in the game long enough for it to pay off. But the people who have made this exercise manageable with a short list and stayed consistent in their outreach with that short list are the ones who ultimately see the payoff.
David, those are excellent points, and it will actually provide some really good tidbits for when we do some postings following the podcast and some takeaways. 9 to 35 key contacts that you nurture, those are really good numbers. And then 14 points of contact. I mean, those for a lot of people, it wouldn't be intuitive. They would almost feel like, oh, that's a long way to go.
It's a long way, yeah.
I met this person at a cocktail party. I took him for lunch. How come he didn't give me any business,
Right.
And the thing of the 14 contact points provides better perspective to say, no, it's a lengthy path ahead, but that's the path to success.
Well, that's why I think it's important for us to find ourselves in environments where we have repeated contact with someone, right? Oh, I sit on the board with that person, so I know I'm going to see them every 2 to 3 months. Or, oh, we're part of the same group, or we're in the same firm. We're going to keep running into each other, because then you rack up those 14 interactions
100%.
a little more organically.
100%. David, really appreciate your time today. It's been excellent to have you on the show. I had many questions I had to skip for you, but inevitably I knew we would run out of time.
Well, Gary, it's always a pleasure. And like you said, we could talk for hours. So I'm glad we had a chance to catch up here.
Thank you very much.